Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Sun is up, the drinks are hot, and now it's time for our first cup. Today, tell your story. So, I remember the first time I just dropped someone in a fight. It's like straight out dropped him. His name was Andrew. Andrew and I had fought before. This was kind of one of those schoolyard things. Andrew and I had fought before, but today was, well, that day, I should say, was different, right? I forget how it got into this point, but I had just taken my left fist and I just cocked it back as far as I could and I just drove it straight into his gut, hard as I could. And his eyes just, they just changed. They kind of went glassy and he just wrapped his hands around his gut and he just dropped to his knees over in a flash. And I remember that moment, and I remember other moments in other fights where I dropped people too, like where I, just knocked them out. Right. I remember hearing joints dislocate and pop. I remember losing, toenails. I remember bleeding. I remember getting injured. I just remember hearing, bones fracture, what it felt like. I remember all that. Right. I grew up in a neighborhood that was kind of violent. Right. My dad and I fought a lot until I was like, early teenager into my adolescence. And when that wasn't happening, there was also, I did martial arts like after all that, right? Like I got very comfortable with fighting, right? And I got very comfortable with fighting in a group of like mixed people, right? Like the neighborhood that I grew up in, we were poor, we were united in that, but like, there were migrants and immigrants and people of all different kind of stripes there. And you add in Phoenix, summer days where, well, not just summer, some spring, right? Where it's over 100 degrees, right? You've got a lot of temperature, right? And you've got a lot of temperament to go along with that temperature. And even thinking about it now, there's some very visceral parts of it. But Andrew, that was the first time. Now, as I got older, started kind of getting away from that neighborhood, that environment. I started noticing that kind of the more educated I got, the more I was out in the world beyond, right? The fewer people who kind of understood that background or who were from that background or when I got to graduate school were willing to understand that background, right? Like you may have heard that line before, any technology that is sufficiently advanced looks like magic, right? Well, I've got a corollary to that. Any experience that is sufficiently distant sounds like fantasy, right? I did not meet many people in my PhD program who understood, let alone could comprehend, a moment like dropping Andrew, or that that moment might be part of a broader suite of moments. And that distance, it did something to me. That that kind of disbelief. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, it did something to me. And it wasn't just because some people wanted to ostracize themselves or ostracize me for, talking about my background. It was, I just realized that I'd stopped telling my story. I stopped being open about a lot of things in my past because, again, they just seemed like fantasy to a lot of people. The irony in all this, right, is that I didn't forget about any of it. I would I would hide it in some ways, right? Like if we were in a lab meeting and there was some data, some behavioral data that someone couldn't make sense of, and I'm like, internally I've got, oh wait, I've got something in my experience of either fighting or conflict or growing up poor or growing up male that would help explain this thing that seems unexplainable to everyone. Like I would hide it, right? I would kind of couch it in something that was a little bit more acceptable theoretically or morally to people. But I learned that I had stopped telling my story in any meaningful way. I got really good at telling other people's stories. I got really good at telling stories about data. I got really good at focusing that need to elaborate and elucidate on the world. I got really good at telling other people's stories. But I'd stopped telling my own. And you may be sitting here thinking, well, okay, Ian, I'm with you, but what does this have to do with men's health and men's mental health awareness? Two reasons, fundamentally. One, I know, especially now, especially after the pandemic, especially after I've had time to reflect on this and go and start kind of seeking things out, I am far from the only person that's felt this way. Right? Especially in social psychology, especially in like psych programs generally, right? And some of you may be thinking, well, duh, like those are 70% to 80% women in a lot of places. Like, no wonder. Like, well, yeah, but also, I'm sitting here telling you, despite being in those places, despite being in those spaces, despite being relatively bold about a lot of things, I still stop telling my story. And I've met other men who have been in the same position. And if it's not that they've been in psychology, they've been in other places or spaces where they feel that it's not politically tenable or socially acceptable to speak up about the needs that they have or that people like them have. So I want to give a little bit of visibility to those people because point number two, we need to speak up more. Here's why. And again, I know that my experience can't speak for everyone and that it certainly doesn't. But one of the side effects of having a life history that seems like fantasy to people is that you kind of start seeing every engagement about your identity, about your history, about your needs. It can be easy to see it as a fight, right? But these fights aren't as simple as they were on the playground or in the alleys or at home, right? The rules aren't nearly as set. The rules aren't nearly as straightforward. The winners and losers aren't as clearly defined. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And it can become really easy to get caught up in all that stuff behind the scenes and trying to fit in and trying to pass. I know I did. Um, and I did a lot of good work. But I also know that in the places that I was passing, there were parts of me that were just absolutely silent. They went unseen. It's like I had to put my hand over their mouth, just say, just keep it quiet for another year. We'll hit that milestone. We'll get that promotion. We'll get that paper out. We'll get that study published. Just hold it in. I realize now that was not the right approach to take because one, I know I'm kind of doing sub levels here, but just stick with me. One, those fights aren't worth it, right? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. No matter if someone's talking to you about inclusivity and all these other things, wanting to see more in the world, if they're not willing to listen to the totality of things, then trust their actions, not their words. But number two, the other thing that I found, and I was just reminded of this yesterday, and it's funny when I start looking for it, even with the small presence that I have, it happens quite a fair amount, is that when I tell my story and when I tell the stories of other people, um, they get attention in a good way as well, right? And I'm not some creator with a massive following. I'm not someone who's got hundreds of thousands of people across all of these platforms, right? Like, I mean, this YouTube channel, like, I'm super thankful for it. We just passed not only 50 but 60 subscribers. Hell yes, great. But like, I'm not huge, right? Um, my blog that I've had for a long time, also not huge, but it's touching people and it's getting them to think. And I'm finding a lot more allies than I thought that I knew I had. I had been locked into not telling my story for so long, and I'd been locked into the idea of having to fight for that story for so long that it kind of fell outside of my awareness that I might not need to fight. I might just be able to tell my story. And so I encourage you to tell your story as well. Now, no matter what you've heard or what I've said, death comes for us all. A closed mouth never gets fed. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your men. We'll speak again soon.